Hey pals, I'm here today to talk about the 4 books that I read in the month of September. So, I only read 4 books because I DNF'd, I think, 10 books. I always talk about my DNFs over on my Patreon, so if you're interested in hearing about the books that I gave up on, you can hear about them down below. I also, excitingly, have recently created a Discord for all of my Patreon members, so tiers 1 to 3, tier 1 starts at $1, and I've been really enjoying that, just being able to chat to people live. And I'm also creating a book club tier, which by the time this video is launched should be live on the Patreon, and that's $3, and we read a book every month and chat about it. So if you're interested, you can look at that down below. If you are not interested, obviously do not feel obligated. I'm just really happy to have you here and chatting in the comments. So, finished 4, DNF 10. I also just didn't read a lot. I don't feel like I spent a lot of time reading in September. I feel like work was pretty busy towards the end of the month, so I felt quite brain dead in the evenings and watched a lot of TV. And also we went to Center Parcs for a few days with my brother and his wife and played board games like the whole time. And whenever I go on holiday with other people, I just don't read at all because, you just talk the whole time and feel rude getting a book out. So I took a book with me. I think I took 3 books with me. Very optimistic, literally didn't crack the spine on any of them. So yeah, but I had a really good month with the 4 books I did read. They were all really good reads and yeah, really enjoyed them. So I'm going to talk about them now. Also, I've obviously had my hair cut. I've only just had it done. I'm not 100% happy with it. I want the fringe to be a bit more fine and choppy rather than this sort of blunt cut. But obviously just got to get used to it. And I think I also want a bit more hair at the back. What are your thoughts? But I definitely like the whole mini mullet vibe. I'm going to keep it, but just adjust it slightly. So it may change in the coming weeks. We shall see. Anyway, you're not here to hear about my hair. You're here to hear about books. So I read one non-fiction book in September, and that is the book that everyone's talking about, I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jennette McCurdy. I'd never heard of Jennette McCurdy. I'm a bit too old for iCarly. It's a show I'm aware existed, but never watched. And I didn't know anything about this author's life story. As I'm sure you've heard, this is a memoir predominantly focused on the fact that Jennette believes her mother was a toxic narcissist. Her mother was immensely controlling, forced Jennette into acting at a very young age, I think 4 or 5, controlled Jennette's life in every way, and sort of controlled the whole family's life really. And yeah, Jennette grew up in just a really oppressive, toxic, controlling environment and hated every moment of acting, but did it anyway. You sort of follow that journey, and then the final third of the book is much more focused on the point after her mother passed away, when she deals with a really severe eating disorder and also some addiction issues, and that is delved into quite deeply. So, thoughts on the memoir. I really enjoyed it. I didn't love it. I think that the writing style in and of itself isn't anything spectacular. It serves the purpose. And I like her quite dry sense of humour, which really came across well in the audiobook because she performs it herself and she has a really dry voice, which I enjoyed. But the decision the author made with this book that I think admired in large part, but had a slight issue with, she made the decision to recount the story of her childhood and adolescence with no reflection. So she'd tell you what she thought at that age, but not what she thinks looking back. And I think that worked when we were looking at the really young Jennette, because it made you see those moments through a child's perspective and understand why a child would go along with those things, because they don't understand. They just want their mother to love them. I think as the book got to the final sections, it felt like we were much closer to the present day, and for there still to be a lack of reflection just felt like Jennette hadn't really fully worked through these things. And I got to 40 minutes from the end of the audiobook, and I looked and I was super surprised I only had 40 minutes to go, because it felt like there was still so much to work through and to process. And I think what I find surprising about this memoir is it feels like maybe it was written a little bit too early, like it's ultimately Jennette's decision what she wants to put out there, but the type of memoirs I really enjoy are when people have given themselves enough time and space to properly process and work through all the things they've been through and to sort of draw conclusions. And I don't think Jennette is at that point. At the end of the book, she's still in a very fragile state, has sort of started seeking help with therapists, and is trying to work through a lot of those things, but it's still very early. And I feel like if like the internet didn't exist, then I'd be super worried for Jeanette. I'd be like, where the hell is she now? Like, is she okay? Wonderfully, the internet does exist, and so you can go see Jeanette in interviews now and know that she's doing much better than she was when she wrote this book a couple of years ago. But yeah, I almost wish the her now was writing this book rather than the her 2 years ago. Does that make sense? I also think that I don't know if I could recommend this book because the final section that focuses on eating disorders is incredibly graphic, like horribly graphic in a couple of different ways. It's really graphic just in terms of like the physicality of what happens to your body when you have an eating disorder, but also she gives you details of her weight at different stages of her eating disorder. And I know that can be really triggering for people who have a history of eating disorders, or even people who have never pursued an eating disorder but it's something they've always had at the back of their mind. I've read lots of discussions about the fact that a lot of people don't think it's helpful to actually write down the weight you were because it's really triggering for people who are trying to recover. And I listen on audio, so I don't know if in the physical edition there's trigger warnings at the start, but I think there's a discussion to be had about how useful it is to give that level of detail. That's not on Jeanette. Like, if she wants to discuss that, that's her decision. I think it's maybe a broader discussion as to what we think is sort of safe to be out there for people to access without really big warnings on it. So I would say if you have any trepidation about reading about eating disorders and, you know, a real struggle with body image, then like don't go anywhere near this book. So I enjoyed it. I wouldn't read another book that Jennette McCurdy releases for her writing style alone. Whereas with a lot of my favourite memoirs, I would. I finish them and I'm like, oh my God, even if they didn't have this story to tell, they clearly should always have been a writer. I don't feel that way about Jennette McCurdy. But I will be interested to see what she does. I really like her. And she's somebody I'd like to sort of support going forward, so we shall see. Then I reread a book. I'm trying to reread all 6 of Sarah Waters' novels, and this is the 3rd one I've reread. This is my 4th favourite. I'm doing the rereads in an odd order. I've now reread my 2nd, 3rd and 4th favourite. So I've still got my 2 least favourites and my favourite to go. My favourite is Fingersmith, from memory. But I reread The Paying Guest, and this is, I think, one of the ones that people enjoy the least. This one has quite low ratings on Goodreads. Just to preface all of this with the fact that Sarah Waters is my favourite author, living or dead, and every single day of the week, if you ask me this question, she is the first author that comes to mind. I don't change my mind on different days. She's my favourite author. And she's my favourite author because I love historical fiction, but I think once you've read Sarah Waters' historical fiction, nothing else comes close because it's perfect. Like, nothing feels overdone. It's so clear that she spends so long writing and researching these books. Fingers crossed she has another novel coming out next year, but this one is her most recent, and this came out quite a few years back. Yeah, this is one of the ones that people enjoy a bit less, and I think there's a couple of reasons for that. This is nearly 600 pages, and the premise of this is set in 1922. We're following this quite well-to-do woman called Frances, who's in like her late 20s. She lives with her mother. Her brother died in the war, and her father died quite soon after, and they found out that he'd been spending all their money, and they can no longer afford to live to the same standard, and they can't afford a maid or a cook, like tragedy. So they decide to take in boarders to be able to sort of keep up appearances that they can afford this house when actually there's people living there and paying them for the rooms. Everybody down the road calls these boarders the paying guests because it sounds a bit, you know, more well-to-do. And the paying guests are a young married couple who are of like do you say clerk or clerk class? I don't know, but that's what they are. And there's a bit of a class barrier between them, but if you don't know, Sarah Waters writes books that feature like lesbian characters. Quite quickly, Frances builds a friendship with the wife, who's called Lillian, and that develops quite quickly. You feel like maybe there's more than a friendship there. And then, I won't spoil anything, the blurb gives a bit more away. Something happens towards the probably 400 pages in that sort of changes the tone of the novel, and it becomes a lot darker. A lot of the criticism of this novel is that it's just too long, and like you could have reduced the first 400 pages by like half. I don't agree, because I love every sentence Sarah Waters writes, and I like take such pleasure in just hearing Frances, like descriptions of Frances like cleaning the floor making a cup of tea, doing the gardening. Love it all. I could completely picture this house. I would love to see this adapted into like a BBC drama. I think that would be like pure delight if it was done well. And what I love about this book is I think so much of this book is about the idea of waiting, okay? So the first chunk is about the sort of the waiting for a possible romance, the waiting for a relationship to develop, that moment when you're unsure what the other person thinks about you. And so you have this constant fizziness in your stomach because you're waiting to see what happens with them, right? Then after this event happens, towards the end, the waiting changes to dread. And I think it's a really interesting way to look at how you can want time to speed up so that you move forward in a relationship, and then suddenly you can want time to slow down. And I think the passage of time is really well examined in this book. I love Sarah Waters' examinations of class. I think that's done really well in particularly in this novel and in The Little Stranger. So yeah, would highly recommend. Like for a Sarah Waters novel, this is a 4 out of 5, but it's not one of her best, but compared to like every other author out there, this is a 5-star read. So there you go, there's that one. And I really loved rereading it. I took such pleasure in it. I don't have an excellent memory, so there was lots I had forgotten. And yeah, I think maybe rereading is better than reading a book for the first time, because unless your tastes have really changed, you know you're going to read a book that you're going to really enjoy, and there's some sense of comfort in revisiting a book, and I loved it, and it just reminded me that I should do it way more often. Then I picked up another quite chunky book, and that is Seeds of Betrayal by David B. Coe. This is a hilarious cover. There's a woman with her tits out there. Can you see that? This was published in the 90s, and it's never been republished because it's not a very popular fantasy series. But I heard Chris over at Chris's Bookish Cauldron talk about it. Here's my go-to for fantasy recommendations. This is a 5-book fantasy series called Winds of the Fallens. I can't really talk much about this book, although I will say, having read the first 2 books in the series, they don't really have a contained arc. It feels more like one long book that's been split into 5, if you know what I mean. The premise of this is, if you don't want to know a ton, it is a political fantasy, very detailed political fantasy that's super interesting, and you're reading from the perspectives of both sides of this political battle, which I find really interesting. This is set in a world where there's these 6 countries that are all governed by humans, like lords and kings. And there is another race of people called the Circe. The Circe have magic, but because of their magic, they die a lot younger. They die when they're 40. Some make it a little bit older, but not much. They are physically much weaker, and they always have white hair and yellow eyes. And hundreds of years ago, they tried to take control of the humans and subjugate them, and it didn't work. And they got overthrown by the humans, and loads of them were killed. And they now are viewed as an inferior race. But because of their magical ability, a lot of them are political advisors to lords and kings. And as the first book opens, all these events that are happening that change the line of succession to the throne, that feel like coincidences or accidents, but actually you learn really early on are part of a plot by a rebellion of the Circe trying to take back the power they once had. And like I said, you follow both sides. Incredibly complicated politically, a ton of character names to remember. That is a critique I have. There's no character list, which would be very helpful. I really enjoy this. The reason this is a 4-star read for me, and the first one was as well, the reason they're not 5-star is because there is so much happening, not fast-paced, slow-paced, but just a lot happening. And there are so many characters, there isn't really much time for much character development. So whilst I like the characters, I feel like they're probably at 30% depth compared to what they could be if the books were a hell of a lot longer, but they're already pretty long. So I really enjoy them. I really like the writing style, the level of description, the pacing really works for me. But yeah, I'd say people who enjoy Song of Ice and Fire would really enjoy this because it's political fantasy, but there is, I think, a lot more characters and you get less time to get to know them. So if what you really loved about Song of Ice and Fire was the characters, you won't reach quite the same level of this series, at least not yet, but I'm really enjoying it. Can't wait to carry on with book 3, hopefully later this month. And then the last book I was sent quite recently from the publisher, so I've read it very quickly, and it was in my autumn TBR, and I buddy read this with my lovely subscriber Amanda. We have really similar reading taste, so yeah, it's really nice to do buddy reads because we've always got books we're both planning on reading quite soon. And the book we read together was Amy and Lan by Sadie Jones. This has a really autumnal cover. This was one of those books that's like a bit of a shame because we had really similar thoughts on this. We were both absolutely loving this. I think for me, this is a fairly short novel. It is 300 pages. I think I was really loving it until like just past halfway, and then it started to sort of drop off a bit, maybe the last third. The premise of this is this opens, I think, in like 2005. We're following 2 7-year-old children called Amy and Lan. 3 sets of parents bought a farm, a sort of broken down farm, and renovated a few of the buildings on the property so that they could live there. And they all raised their children in sort of quite a communal way. They're not a cult, but they sort of live a little bit separately to the community. Not separately because they're quite close to a lot of the people in the community, and the children go to traditional schools, but they raise their children quite differently. And so the initial opening to the book and the blurb sort of describes this level of tension, and I felt in large part that like maybe something awful was going to happen to these children, because there's quite a lot of scenes where you're like, fucking hell, they shouldn't be playing with this farm machinery, or like they shouldn't be climbing on that roof, and there's no parents around to watch what's happening. So there's like this building sense of dread, which I really enjoyed. I loved the writing style, really descriptive of like nature and the farmland, very slice of life. I love the descriptions of Christmas and like bonfire night and things like that, really beautifully done. If you would like that sort of real sense of place and living seasonally and all those sorts of things, it's all done beautifully. Coming of age story, it's done really well, all those things. However, at the start of the book, there's a hint that there's a sort of conflict going on between some of the parents that the children don't really understand. And in the final chunk of the novel, that becomes much more the focus, which I didn't mind, but I just felt like the book almost like fizzled out. Like the last 100 pages were just a bit like, oh, like meh. Like it felt like a 5-star. I was absolutely loving it. It's like having this balloon that's like about to pop because I'm loving it so much, and then really slowly the air just comes out the balloon for like the last 100 pages. That's how I felt, which was a shame. However, I enjoyed it enough that I would definitely pick up what she brings out next. I know her previous books have got quite poor ratings on Goodreads, but I like her writing style enough that I would definitely like to pick one of those up, so feel free to recommend me any of her previous books. The other thing I'll add about this book is that they live on a farm, and they do raise like animals, both for like meat and dairy and eggs. I'm a vegan, so like I obviously struggle with scenes. There are scenes where like animals are killed and animals die in this book, which obviously I struggled with. However, I didn't mind it because the discussions that I had, I think, are things that made me go vegan, in that, like, for example, at one point Lan doesn't want to eat the turkey because he's just seen the turkey be killed for Christmas, and he said, you know, everything else on the table is delicious enough that I don't want to. And then one of the women raises the chickens, but she won't kill them herself because she says, I love them too much to kill them myself. And there's this discussion about the other adults say, well, if you can't kill them yourself, you shouldn't be eating them, which is, again, something I completely believe, this disconnect we have from the food on our plate. If that's the only thing that allows us to eat it, then we seriously need to question that. And those discussions are had in this book, which I really appreciated. My other slight complaint about this is that I did feel like Amy and Lan's voices are not distinct at all. Like, the only way you can tell them apart is by who they call mum or dad. And I think that's maybe intentional because they're supposed to feel like two halves of one whole, but it also felt like maybe the author just wasn't very good at writing two different voices. So this ended up being like a 3.5-star read, but I will always remember it, yeah, with like a sense of like loving it, but also disappointment. Does that make sense? So yeah, I would recommend, if any of those things sound like your sort of thing, coming of age, beautiful nature writing, slice of life, a sense of dread, but just be prepared to maybe not love the end as much as you love the start. So there is that one. So those are the 4 books I read. I feel like this video is not much shorter than when I talk about lots more books. I have been thinking recently that maybe I should do wrap-ups like every 5 books, or maybe like every 2 weeks rather than every month, because it just gives me more time to talk about books. Let me know if you would prefer that. Like, do you prefer to hear about a book for like 3 minutes or like 5 or 6? What are your thoughts? I prefer hearing people talk about a book for like 5 or 6 minutes, just because I think 3 minutes is really hard to get across what the book was about and also like all your feelings about it. But obviously you're the people watching this, not me. So I'd be interested to know your thoughts on that. Do let me know if you've read any of these books, and if so, what you thought about them. Also, I'd love to know your thoughts on rereading, and always interested in like your thoughts on Sarah Waters. Have you read all of her novels? If you have, which are your faves? Do you have any books that you think are similar to Sarah Waters? All these things I want to know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.